Elias had never seen the royal summons before, and he was fairly certain that was a good thing. As the quiet librarian of Altheria's Grand Library, his life revolved around ink-stained fingers, dusty tomes, and the occasional patron who sneezed at the sight of a scroll. Warriors, royal decrees, and marriage contracts were the kinds of things he only read about in books, never the sort of problems that found him in the flesh. But there it was, the parchment sealed with the golden crest of the kingdom itself, resting on his desk as if it had been waiting for him all along. He eyed it warily. The royal seal gleamed under the flickering candlelight, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, heavier than any book he had ever lifted. To Elias Dawn, keeper of the Grand Library, by order of King Roderick, you are hereby summoned to fulfill the marriage contract with the warrior clan of Vargolm. Elias's eyes darted up and down the words, trying to make sense of them. His hand trembled as he reread the line. A warrior clan, he whispered to himself, they must mean someone else. He knew the kingdom was in desperate need of alliances, but surely there was some mistake. He had not swung a sword in his life. Not even a wooden one. The library's familiar silence seemed suddenly suffocating. Elias ran a hand through his messy brown hair, trying to calm the fluttering panic in his chest. He imagined the warriors, massive, battle-hardened men and women with scars and armor, axes strapped to their backs, eyes like sharpened steel. And then there was him, a man whose most fearsome weapon was knowledge of the correct order of historical treaties. It didn't make sense. But royal summonses were not optional. They were commands. Failure was unthinkable. Elias looked around his tiny office, cluttered with stacks of scrolls and books piled so high they seemed to defy gravity. His life had been orderly, predictable, safe. He read, catalogued, and sometimes whispered facts to himself that no one would ever care to hear. Now, all of that was about to vanish. A knock at the door jolted him. Elias. The voice belonged to Marvin, the library's assistant. Is it true? Did the king really summon you? Elias swallowed hard and nodded, holding up the parchment like it was a ticking bomb. Yes, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But it must be a mistake. They want a warrior, Marvin. Me? I'm just a librarian. Marvin's eyes widened. They never make mistakes with royal summonses. If it says your name, he trailed off. Elias, you have to go. They're serious. And the Vargolm clan, they're legendary. People don't just marry into that clan without, he gestured vaguely, implying the terrifying strength of the warriors, the dangerous history, the consequences of failing a royal contract. Elias sank into his chair. I can't fight anyone, he admitted, almost ashamed. I've never even been in a proper fight. I read about them. That's all I can do. Marvin placed a hand on his shoulder. Then maybe that's exactly why they sent you. Elias looked up, confused. What do you mean? Marvin shrugged, uneasily. I don't know. Maybe the king, he sees something in you. Maybe the Vargolm clan, maybe they need someone who isn't a warrior, who thinks differently. But, Elias, it's terrifying. Don't think they'll go easy on you. Not for 1 second. Elias felt a cold sweat creep down his spine. He had thought his life was uneventful. He had thought that the most dangerous thing he would ever face was a collapsed bookshelf or a misfiled manuscript. Now, he was about to step into a world where every muscle, every reflex, and every ounce of courage he lacked would be tested in ways he couldn't even imagine. The journey to the castle was a blur. He barely slept the night before, tossing and turning amid visions of massive warriors towering over him, axes glinting in torchlight, their eyes sizing him up as a joke, or a mistake to be corrected. When he finally left, the city streets felt different. People stared. Whispers followed him. The librarian, sent to Vargolm. Some faces were amused. Others were doubtful. Many seemed to shake their heads as though mourning an outcome already decided. Elias clutched his satchel of books tightly, as if the knowledge contained within could shield him from whatever awaited. Each step felt heavier than the last, his thoughts spiraling. Why me? Why not someone trained? Why not a soldier, a knight, anyone but me? The castle gates loomed in the distance, a fortress of stone and steel. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly foreign. The guards at the entrance eyed him with suspicion, hands resting casually on their weapons. State your name and purpose, one of them barked. I am Elias Dawn, librarian of the Grand Library. I was summoned, his voice faltered under the weight of their glares. The guard raised an eyebrow. Summoned, you say? By the king? Elias nodded, swallowing his fear. Yes. A long pause followed, the kind that stretched every second into an eternity. Then, with a gesture, the guards allowed him through. But the look in their eyes, half disbelief, half amusement, reminded him that he had walked into a place where he would have to prove himself against expectations, against appearances, against history itself. As he entered the great hall, the enormity of the Vargulm clan became undeniable. Massive banners adorned the walls, each one bearing the insignia of warriors whose names were spoken with reverence and fear. Suits of armor gleamed in the torchlight. The air smelled of metal, leather, and something sharper, discipline, or danger, or both. And then he saw them. The warriors. Not one, but dozens, surrounding a long table, their eyes fixed on him. Some were armed, some not, but every one of them radiated strength, skill, and a confidence he could not hope to match. They whispered among themselves, laughter and incredulous murmurs mixing in the heavy air. Elias's legs felt like lead. He forced himself forward, trying to ignore the way his hands shook. He had read about warriors. He had catalogued their histories, their battles, their legendary feats. But standing before them in person, he realized he had been naive. Knowledge had not prepared him for the sheer presence of these people, nor for the silent question that hung in the room: what is this fragile human doing here? The clan elder, a massive man whose armor seemed to carry the weight of decades of battles, stepped forward. His eyes, sharp as flint, scrutinized Elias from head to toe. "So," he said slowly, his voice deep and commanding, "the kingdom sends us a librarian in place of a warrior." The hall went silent. Whispers died mid-word. The weight of expectation pressed down like a storm cloud. Elias swallowed hard. I am here to fulfill the contract," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I may not be a warrior, but I—" The elder's gaze cut him off. "We shall see," he said. "We shall see." And with that, Elias realized that his life of books, scrolls, and quiet study had ended. He was about to enter a world where failure could be fatal, where every misstep could ruin not just him, but the kingdom itself. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a flicker of determination sparked. Perhaps knowledge could be a weapon. Perhaps wit could stand where strength could not. Or perhaps he would fail spectacularly. Either way, there was no turning back. The journey from the castle gates to the heart of Vargulm territory was grueling, though not for the reasons Elias had expected. The path wound through jagged cliffs and dense forests, where shadows seemed to watch him, and the wind whispered threats he could almost understand. He had packed lightly, a few scrolls, some parchment, and the few tools of his trade that might, in some bizarre way, prove useful. But in truth, he carried little else besides a nervous determination. When the gates of the warrior stronghold finally rose before him, Elias felt as if he was staring at a fortress carved from sheer rock. Towers jutted like jagged teeth into the sky, banners snapping in the wind with symbols of axes, swords, and shields that seemed to thrum with silent power. The air itself was different here, heavy with the scent of iron, smoke, and disciplined strength. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself, gripping the strap of his satchel. "You can do this. Books helped kings, maybe they can help you." He did his best to step forward with confidence, though the click of his boots on the stone path sounded far too loud, echoing like a warning to the warriors inside. The guards at the main gate were no more welcoming than those at the castle. Their armor gleamed like polished stone, and their hands rested casually on massive swords that looked capable of splitting a man in two with ease. One of them, a tall woman with a scar tracing her jawline, stepped forward. "Name and purpose," she said, her voice cold and clipped. "I am Elias Dawn, librarian of the Grand Library," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was summoned to fulfill the marriage contract." The guards exchanged glances, one of them letting out a low whistle that Elias was sure was meant for him. "A librarian, huh?" the scarred woman said. "They didn't send a warrior?" I'm told this was the king's choice," Elias stammered. It's a long story." The woman's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Elias thought she might turn him away, or worse. But finally, she nodded curtly and motioned him forward. "Fine. Step inside. But don't embarrass yourself. The clan will not tolerate weakness." Elias swallowed. Weakness. That word hit him like a hammer. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the stones themselves were pressing down on him, reminding him of his inadequacy. Inside the stronghold, the reality of the warrior clan struck him all at once. The main hall was massive, high ceilings arching like a cathedral of iron and stone. Torches lined the walls, casting flickering shadows that seemed almost alive. Around a long table sat the Vargulm warriors, each one more imposing than the last. Muscles like sculpted stone, eyes sharp as blades, and expressions that could cut through a man's confidence. Elias's heart thudded in his chest. He had studied warriors in history books, memorized their tactics and codes, but no page had prepared him for the presence of so many living, breathing legends. Whispers ran through the hall as the warriors leaned forward, their curiosity palpable. The elder of the clan, Brawn, rose from his seat. He was a mountain of a man, his armor marked with battle scars that spoke of decades of warfare. His gaze fell on Elias like a hammer striking steel. So, Bjorn's voice rumbled, echoing through the hall, the kingdom sends a librarian in place of a warrior. Are we to laugh or cry? Elias felt the eyes of every warrior bore into him. The weight of expectation, fear, and judgment pressed down on him so heavily that he thought he might collapse. He straightened his spine as best he could. I am here to fulfill the contract, he said. I may not be a warrior in the traditional sense, but I intend to honor this agreement in every way I can. Bjorn's gaze narrowed, a faint smirk forming at the edge of his lips. We shall see, he said. We do not take kindly to those who fail us. You will live with the clan, train with the clan, and prove whether you are worthy of this alliance, or we will send word to the king that his choice has been mistaken. Mistaken. Elias felt the word pierce him like an arrow. But he had no choice. He could not run. He could not hide. He could only step into a world where every muscle, every reflex, every ounce of courage he lacked would be tested. As he was escorted through the stronghold, the enormity of the place became apparent. Training yards stretched out like vast arenas, filled with warriors practicing combat drills, their movements precise and lethal. Weapons of all kinds hung on walls or were clutched in massive hands. The clang of metal on metal rang constantly, a rhythm of power that Elias could feel in his bones. He passed rooms where warriors sparred in brutal matches, their faces calm, focused, and utterly unyielding. And then he passed the living quarters, Spartan, efficient, devoid of any unnecessary comfort. Here, every object had a purpose, every space a function. Elias felt out of place in a world built for strength, not study. Finally, he arrived at the small chamber assigned to him. It was modest, larger than his library office but bare, furnished with little more than a cot, a desk, and a chair. He set down his satchel, the weight of it suddenly comforting. These were his tools, his weapons in a world that had none of his familiar rules. That night, Elias lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the stronghold, the echoing footfalls, the occasional clash of swords, the low, rhythmic breathing of warriors settling in for the night. He felt like an intruder, a single candle flickering against a storm. And yet, beneath the fear, a spark of determination burned. Knowledge had been his shield all his life. Strategy, observation, and intellect had allowed him to survive in a world of paper and ink. Perhaps here, in a place where Brawn ruled, there was still a place for him, if he could find a way to wield his mind as deftly as these warriors wielded swords. As he drifted toward a restless sleep, Elias could hear Bjorn's voice in his memory, "We shall see." Yes, he thought. We shall see indeed. Tomorrow, the trials would begin. And tomorrow, he would have to face a truth he had never confronted. The world did not care that he was a librarian. The world cared that he survive. And survive he must. The first rays of sunlight crept across the stronghold, glinting off the steel of the training grounds. Elias awoke to the clanging of swords and the rhythmic pounding of leather boots against stone. Sleep had offered little solace. His mind replayed every whispered warning and every judgmental glance from the warriors. Today was the day of the trials. He dressed quickly, clutching his satchel as if it were armor. Outside, the clan waited. The warriors lined the training yard in perfect formation, their expressions a mixture of amusement, skepticism, and mild impatience. At the head of them stood Brawn, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the smaller courtyard. "Welcome, librarian," Brawn boomed, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Today you will face the first of your trials. Strength, agility, and courage will be tested. Fail any, and you bring shame not only to yourself but to the kingdom that sent you." Elias's stomach tightened. Strength and agility were the very things he lacked. Courage, he had in small doses, but not nearly enough to face what awaited. The first trial was deceptively simple, or at least, it appeared so at first glance. A row of heavy wooden dummies, each bristling with spikes and weighted limbs, awaited him. The task, disarm and disable them within a strict time limit. The warriors watched silently as Elias stepped forward, his small frame dwarfed by the towering training dummies. He swung his arms, attempting a practice strike, but the first dummy barely budged, and he nearly lost his balance. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Pathetic, one of the younger warriors muttered, shaking his head. Elias clenched his teeth. Think, Elias. Think. He took a deep breath, stepping back to observe. He remembered the diagrams he had studied in the library, the principles of leverage, pivot points, and force distribution. If he could not overpower the dummies, he could outsmart them. With careful calculation, he adjusted his stance, used the momentum of the weighted arms, and struck in precise sequences that sent each dummy toppling in ways that were almost elegant. By the end of the trial, he had not defeated the dummies through brute force, but through methodical strategy. A few warriors nodded in grudging respect, while others remained skeptical. Bjorn's expression was unreadable. Next, Bjorn said, agility and endurance. The second trial was a complex obstacle course, walls to scale, ropes to climb, beams to balance across, and pits to leap over. Elias's heart pounded as he stepped to the starting line. His arms ached just watching the others move effortlessly, swinging across ropes, leaping over walls, landing without so much as a stumble. Elias tried to mimic their movements, but within seconds, he was exhausted, slipping from a rope and landing awkwardly on the ground. The laughter of some warriors stung like fire. I can't do this, he thought, staring at the daunting course. I'm going to fail, and they'll tell the king. Then he remembered something his mentor at the library had said, when brute force fails, observation is your ally. Elias studied the course carefully. He noticed patterns in the placements, small imperfections in the beams, and how some walls had tiny grooves that could be used as footholds. Using his observations, he adapted. He didn't climb like the warriors, he navigated using the weaknesses in the course. By the end, he had completed the obstacle, slower than the others but unbroken, relying on intellect rather than raw power. Bjorn's eyes narrowed. Clever, he muttered under his breath. We'll see if cleverness alone is enough. The final trial of the day was the most dreaded, combat. Each participant would face a skilled warrior in a test of battle readiness. Elias's opponent was a hulking man named Darik, known for his lightning strikes and ruthless efficiency. Elias's knees shook as Darik stepped forward, sword in hand. Elias had never held a sword before, much less faced someone trained to kill. As Darik lunged, he barely raised his weapon in time. The strike grazed his shoulder, sending pain shooting through his body. Panicked, he tried to attack. Each movement was clumsy, uncoordinated. Darik laughed, and the other warriors leaned forward, eager to see the inevitable failure. But Elias refused to surrender. He remembered the tactical manuals he had studied, the diagrams of ancient duels. Instead of trying to match Darik's strength, he observed his patterns, the way he shifted his weight, the way his eyes followed the movement of the sword. Using the slightest misstep, Elias dodged at precise moments, redirecting Darik's attacks just enough to create openings. He couldn't strike with power, but he could strike with strategy. A quick push here, a pull there, and Darik stumbled, surprised. The courtyard erupted in murmurs. Bjorn stepped closer, his massive shadow falling over Elias. You survive by wits, not muscle, he said, his tone a mixture of warning and begrudging respect. Do not think that cleverness alone will carry you through what is to come. But, it may yet serve you. Elias exhaled, exhausted but alive. His arms ached, his body trembled, and sweat stung his eyes. He had survived the trials, not by being a warrior in the conventional sense, but by turning knowledge into a weapon. As he limped toward his chamber that evening, the whispers of the clan followed him. Some were admiration, some disbelief. The librarian, he survived, someone muttered. By thinking, not fighting. Elias sank onto his cot, every muscle screaming in protest. He had learned something crucial today. In a world dominated by strength, his mind was his only true weapon. And if he could sharpen it further, if he could anticipate, adapt, and outthink, perhaps he could survive the challenges ahead. Yet even as he allowed himself a fleeting sense of accomplishment, a nagging fear remained. He had passed the first day. But the clan would not stop. The enemies of the marriage contract would not wait. And Elias, the human librarian in a warrior's world, realized that this was only the beginning. Somewhere deep in the shadows of the stronghold, eyes watched him. Calculating, patient, and possibly deadly. The trials of strength and wit had ended, but the real test was only beginning. Elias tightened his fingers around the strap of his satchel, the weight of it grounding him. He was unarmed in a world of warriors, yet armed with knowledge, strategy, and the stubborn determination to survive. Tomorrow, he thought, would demand more than just cleverness. It would demand courage. And he was not sure he had enough of that, yet. The morning air in the Vargolm stronghold carried a chill that made Elias shiver as he stepped out of his chamber. After the trials, his body ached in ways he had never known, muscles protesting every movement. But the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the gnawing sense of unease that had settled in his chest. Something was off. He couldn't put a finger on it at first. The warriors moved as usual, training, sparring, and laughing among themselves, but there was an undercurrent, subtle yet undeniable. Glances that lingered a moment too long, whispers that ceased abruptly when he entered a room, shadows that seemed to shift more than they should. Elias had learned to read patterns in books, he could read them here too. The inconsistencies were there, and they told a story. Someone did not want him here. He began walking through the corridors, careful not to draw attention. Every door, every corner, every echo of footfalls became a clue. In the army, he noticed a weapon missing from the rack, Derek's favorite sword, a finely balanced blade, absent without explanation. In the kitchens, the cooks whispered, their eyes darting toward him nervously. And in the training yard, a pair of warriors exchanged a look that spoke of secrets not meant for him to know. It was subtle, but Elias's librarian instincts, his ability to notice the small details, the things that no one else paid attention to, told him the truth. Someone wanted to sabotage the marriage contract. He sat in a quiet corner of the library attached to the stronghold, poring over the few records he could find. Scrolls, ledgers, and training logs offered clues. He discovered inconsistencies in schedules and reports of patrols that had never occurred. Small thefts of supplies that had been dismissed as accidents now appeared intentional. Then came the whispers. Not the usual rumors of court intrigue, but the kind of whispers that spoke of danger. He's not fit for the clan. He'll ruin the pact. The king's choice is weak. Elias clenched his fists. So much of his life had been safe, predictable, measured. Here, in a place of strength, knowledge alone was not enough. But it could be his weapon, if wielded wisely. He needed to know who was behind the threats before it was too late. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Elias decided to act. He waited until most of the warriors were in the hall, celebrating the day's training. Then he slipped into the shadowed corridors, moving quietly, following the trail of subtle clues he had gathered. In a secluded chamber near the outer wall, he found them, two figures hunched over maps, their conversation low and urgent. One was a warrior he recognized, Karen, known for his skill with the spear. The other, a cloaked figure whose face was hidden, but whose intentions were clear. If the librarian is allowed to continue, the marriage contract will fail, the cloaked figure whispered. The king will look foolish, and the clan weakened. Everything depends on removing him before the pact is sealed. Karen nodded, a cruel smile flickering across his face. Don't worry. By tomorrow, he'll be out of the way. The clan will never suspect a thing. Brains mean nothing in a world of steel. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. He could not fight them with strength, but perhaps he could outsmart them. Every tactic he had learned in the library, every pattern he had observed, every strategy he had ever studied, he would need them all. He retreated silently, careful not to alert them. His mind raced as he considered his options. Confrontation would be dangerous, he could be overpowered in seconds. He would need to gather evidence, expose the plot, and perhaps turn the conspirators' own schemes against them. Back in his chamber, Elias pored over every note he had taken, every observation recorded during his stay. He began to map out the conspirators' movements, predict their next actions, and plan contingencies. If he could anticipate them, he might have a chance, not to overpower them, but to outmaneuver them. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a potential ambush. The stronghold, which had once seemed intimidating in its strength, now felt like a labyrinth of danger. And yet, beneath the fear, a quiet determination took root. He could survive this. He must survive this. The next morning, the atmosphere in the stronghold was tense. The warriors carried on their routines, but Elias could sense the subtle tension. He had watched the conspirators closely, noting their habits, predicting their moves. Every step he took, every glance he cast, was calculated. And then it happened. In the training yard, as the warriors practiced, one of the conspirators made their move. A set of weights, carefully positioned, began to fall toward Elias. He had anticipated it, stepping aside at the last second, narrowly avoiding injury. The courtyard erupted in surprise, but Elias's calm reaction drew the attention of everyone present, including Bjorn. Quick thinking, Bjorn said, his deep voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. You are not as defenseless as you appear. Elias's mind raced. The trap had failed, but the conspiracy was real. The conspirators would try again, perhaps more dangerously. He had to act, and soon. Over the next hours, he observed, recorded, and planned. Every subtle gesture, every whispered conversation, every shift in the guards' patrols was a piece of the puzzle. By nightfall, he had enough evidence to expose the plot, not with a sword, not with brute strength, but with knowledge, cunning, and timing. The librarian had entered a world of warriors as an outsider, fragile and underestimated. Yet, it was becoming clear, sometimes, the sharpest weapon was not the one forged from steel, but the one honed in the mind. And as Elias prepared for the confrontation that would test him in ways he had never imagined, he understood the truth of his situation. Survival in Vagum was no longer about training, no longer about enduring the trials of strength, it was about uncovering hidden threats, anticipating danger, and outthinking those who believed him weak. Tomorrow, the conspiracy would face him. And tomorrow, Elias would show that even a human librarian could be more dangerous than any warrior thought possible. The stronghold was unusually quiet that morning. Even the warriors moved with a strange tension in their steps, as if sensing that something was about to unfold. Elias, however, was calm in a way he had never been before. Every observation, every note, every subtle clue from the past days had led to this moment. He knew the conspirators' plan, their roots, and their timing. And he had prepared a countermeasure that relied not on strength, but on foresight, precision, and intellect, the very weapons he had honed in the library. He stepped into the training yard, his satchel slung across his shoulder. Bjorn's massive shadow fell across the courtyard, and Elias could feel the elder's gaze, sharp and unwavering. "The conspirators are clever," Bjorn said, his voice booming. "Do not underestimate the danger. They have thought they could outwit you." Elias nodded. "And they will," he said calmly, "but only if I allow them." The first conspirator, Karen, approached, spear in hand, his expression smug. He had underestimated Elias before, and that had been his first mistake. The cloaked figure who had been the mastermind emerged behind him, a dagger glinting in the torchlight. Elias's mind raced as he positioned himself. He couldn't match their physical skill, but he had prepared every step. The trap was sprung. Karen lunged with his spear, the tip aimed at Elias's chest. But Elias was ready. He had noticed the uneven flagstones in the yard the day before, and he used them to pivot and slip to the side, dodging the strike with precision. The movement was small, almost insignificant, but it unbalanced Karen just enough. Elias's hand shot into his satchel and pulled out a small vial of powder, something he had prepared carefully, a harmless but blinding dust that would give him the momentary advantage he needed. He threw it into the wind, and Karen and the cloaked figure coughed and blinked, unable to see. Seizing the moment, Elias triggered a series of ropes and pulleys he had discreetly tied during his study of the courtyard's layout. The ropes yanked a set of suspended training dummies into motion, knocking into Karen and the cloaked figure, pinning them awkwardly against the walls. The warriors gasped at the sight. Strategy and preparation, not brute force, had turned the tables. Bjorn stepped forward, his voice carrying over the commotion. "Incredible," he said, a rare note of admiration in his tone. He predicted every move, planned every response, and survived without wielding a sword. Elias's pulse raced, but he focused. There was no time to celebrate. The cloaked figure struggled, freeing a hand, and Elias moved swiftly, tossing another vial of dust and signaling to two of the strongest but trustworthy warriors. Together, they restrained the conspirators without a single fatal blow. The courtyard was silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into murmurs of astonishment. "You, the librarian," Karen spat, incredulous. "You tricked us." "I observed," Elias said simply. "I planned." "That is how knowledge becomes a weapon." Bjorn's eyes glimmered with respect. "You have shown us that courage and intellect can rival strength. Today, you have not only defended the marriage contract but proven that there are more ways to be a warrior than with muscle alone." The other warriors nodded, some still shaking their heads in disbelief, but all silently acknowledging the truth. Elias had survived, and triumphed, where brute force alone might have failed. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the stronghold. The conspirators were confined, and their plot fully exposed. The alliance, once threatened, was now secured. And Elias, the human librarian, had earned a place of respect among the warriors, not as one of them in physical prowess, but as a strategist, a thinker, and someone whose mind was as sharp as any blade. That evening, Bjorn invited Elias to a modest feast in his quarters. The elder poured a cup of wine and raised it. "To Elias Dorn," he said, who has reminded us that a warrior is not defined by size or strength alone. Today, you have won our respect, our trust, and the kingdom's alliance. Elias, exhausted but triumphant, raised his cup in return. Thank you, he said quietly. I only did what I had to do, what any of us must do when faced with impossible odds. The feast was filled with laughter and conversation, but Elias's mind was already turning. There would be more challenges ahead, more threats to uncover, and more opportunities to prove that intellect could stand where strength might falter. But for now, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He had stepped into a world of warriors, a place that should have broken him, and instead he had found a way to turn the rules of the game to his advantage. As he looked around the hall, watching the warriors interact, he realized something profound. The world was not divided strictly into those of strength and those of intellect. There were combinations, hybrids, and unexpected advantages. And in that truth lay his greatest power. Outside, the moon rose over the stronghold, casting silver light across the courtyard. Elias stood on the balcony, gazing at the horizon. He was no longer just a librarian. He was a survivor, a strategist, and perhaps, in his own way, a warrior. And for the first time since the royal summons had arrived, he felt ready for whatever came next. Because in a world of steel and shadow, sometimes it was the mind, not the sword, that decided the outcome.